I have just accepted Her Majesty the Queen's kind invitation to form a new government.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic to be back.
In this new era, we're taking a new approach.
It will be uncensorable and uncancelable.
We can't give in to those who say we can't do better.
That is a disgrace.
We can make the West great again.
The status quo is not an option.
Welcome to the Liz Truss Show Extra. Many people in the European elites and the British establishment have been wailing and gnashing their teeth at the new American national security strategy that calls out Europe for policies like mass migration, curtailment of free speech, and in general presiding over cultural and economic decline. Some of us, however, have a lot of sympathy with what America is saying. One such person is Douglas Carswell, who is a Brit by background, but has moved to the United States. Douglas was a Conservative MP with me in 2010. He defected to the United Kingdom Independence Party in 2014, where he campaigned for Brexit. And then in 2021, he moved to Mississippi, which used to be poorer than Britain, but is now richer than Britain, to head up the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Douglas was frustrated that the changes he wanted to achieve in Britain simply weren't being delivered because of the sheer power of the deep state and the administrative state. It's fantastic today to be joined by Douglas Carswell. Douglas, the US have recently published their national security strategy, essentially saying that countries like Britain and other European countries represent a potential security threat to the United States. Do you think that's true?
I think it is extremely alarming reading. For many years, we've always thought of Britain and Europe standing alongside America as part of what you might call the West. It's clear that there are those in America now increasingly concerned about the direction that Europe and Britain are taking. It's not just that they're struggling economically. It's not just that they are unwilling to pay for their defense and they've become a liability in terms of diplomacy and defense. Demographically, they seem to be blissfully unaware of the consequences of importing large numbers of people into the West from outside the West. So there are those in America who've woken up to this. Now, what should alarm us is that people in Europe have not woken up to this. In fact, many voices in Europe were quick to dismiss this new report out the other week as being a MAGA foreign policy and dismiss it as simply Trumpism. Well, I think actually they need to think again and think very carefully. No future US administration, Democrat or Republican, is going to take seriously Europe and Europe's leaders unless they start getting their house in order. Time is running out now for them.
But we have a problem in Europe, and you know this, that many countries are run by leaders who are hated by the populations, who are completely out of touch with what people want. I mean, in Britain, Keir Starmer's now on 15% in the opinion polls. Macron is on similar levels of popularity. And the country has essentially been run by an elite who don't represent the views of the public. And despite the fact that the public keep voting for change, they're not getting any change because there's a blobby, technocratic bureaucracy actually in charge.
Yeah. I mean, take Britain as an example, a country you and I know extremely well. The condition in Britain is absolutely dire. Economic growth has essentially stalled since 2008. Since 2008, there's been very little per capita growth of any kind at all. By comparison, I happen to now live and work in Mississippi, where I run a free market think tank. Mississippi is often regarded as the poorest state in America. Here, last year, we had 5% real income increase in average household incomes in Mississippi. In other words, in the poorest state in America, in a single year, there was more real income growth than in the whole of the United Kingdom over the past decade. And I think people in Europe and Britain are only now beginning to wake up to just how dire things are. One of the reasons, and you alluded to this, is Britain has essentially been run by a radical leftist elite for the past 30 years. Now, it's not been a declared revolution, but ever since Tony Blair took over with his landslide majority in 1997, we've had a succession of what you would call Blairite governments. These are leftist governments. Now, Tony Blair himself may have only been prime minister for 10 of those past 30 years, but every government since Tony Blair's in 1997 has had the same basic outlook. They believe that experts are infallible, which is why they put running the economy in the hands of organizations like the Bank of England and the experts at the Bank of England who've managed to run the economy and run it into the ground. They put the climate and immigration policy into the hands of the Climate Change Commission and the Immigration Advisory Body. They also happen to believe that rights in Britain are not a product of our proud history and heritage, but are universal. And thirdly, they have, and I think most alarmingly, like all European elites, they have what you might call the blank slate fallacy. They think that human nature is essentially a blank slate and that therefore people are purely a product of their environment and what the state engineers from them. And they believe that essentially people are interchangeable. And this is why they've allowed large numbers of people to come into Britain and Germany and France and everywhere else in the foolish, naive belief that they were importing future Frenchmen and Englishmen and Germans. And I think reality of 30 years of leftist Blairite government in Britain is starting to catch up with the country. People want change, but unfortunately the entire administrative state in Britain is so signed up, so subscribed to this Blairite dogma. I think it's going to be extremely difficult to shake Britain out of her current trajectory and wake her up and stop her from essentially plummeting over the edge.
Well, I had my own battles with the administrative state and the Bank of England and the OBR. And I was very, very frustrated for pretty much the entire period in government, how hard it was to actually do anything and just the sheer resistance to anything that wasn't pro-net zero, pro-mass migration. However, I'd say even I, Douglas, didn't realise quite how bad it was, particularly on migration. I knew we had huge problems with the Human Rights Act. I knew that there was a censorship mentality, but where we are now of people not being deported who have committed serious sexual crimes or people being arrested for free speech violations or posting on X. I mean, it just seems to have gone off a cliff. When did you realise? And is that why you moved to Mississippi?
Well, I realised after Brexit that once Britain got self-government, we were going to have to rediscover the art of self-government. We were, to coin a phrase that you've used before, we were leaving the European Union, but we still had the European disease. And in order to rid ourselves and cure ourselves of that, in order to make ourselves competitive, we would have to rediscover the art of self-government. And so when I having helped achieve Brexit, the thing I went into politics to do, I then stood down from Parliament and set up something called the Good Governance Project. And it was, as the name implies, about trying to create a new way of governing Britain, to re-engineer the administrative machinery in Whitehall. The deep state in America, the Trumpists have often pointed out, is very embedded. Britain, too, has the equivalent of a deep state, an administrative state that is also very embedded. And it is very good at defending its own interests. And simply because you win a majority and win an election, it doesn't mean they're going to do what ministers elected by the people instruct them to do. So I came up with quite a detailed blueprint in late 2019, which was going to, I thought, allow a Boris Johnson future majority to make the changes that needed to be made. And I came up with some quite detailed ideas for a department of the Prime Minister to drive through change, reforms so that ministers could sack civil servants, reforms to allow orders in council, these are the British equivalent of executive orders, to be used to control the borders and deal with the activist judges. I came up with a plan for all of this. But when Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, with a massive majority, showed zero interest in doing this, they may subsequently say it was COVID that explains why they did nothing. No, it wasn't. They lost interest in this long before COVID. When it was clear to me that they weren't going to deliver on this, I realized that actually things were going to turn horrible. And I realized that having achieved self-government, we were putting the equivalent of Aaron Burr in charge. When America achieved self-government, they put some very wise people into a town hall in Philadelphia who drafted a sublime constitution. When Britain achieved independence with Brexit, we didn't put wise people like the founders in charge. We put Aaron Burr in charge, people like Aaron Burr in charge, chancers and charlatans and people who are very good now at pointing out the problem about the administrative state, but they absolutely incomprehensibly failed to do anything about it when they were A, in a position to do so, and B, when they were presented with a blueprint that would have allowed them to avoid many of the problems they subsequently ran into. So I realized at that time what was coming. And I thought that, you know what, I'd spent 20 years campaigning for Brexit. I had co-founded the official Brexit campaign. I'd switched parties. I had sacrificed any chance of advancement in the Conservative Party. I took a great risk to myself to join UKIP in order to secure a referendum. I selflessly stood aside and allowed other people to come in and run the subsequent referendum campaign. I then saw them run things into a ditch. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to a part of the world where conservative free market ideas are not dismissed as maverick, where you don't have to compete with charlatans to get to whisper into the ear of those at the top. So I moved then to Mississippi. And I have to say, looking back, I think it was the right call.
I think many other people are following you to leave Britain. We've got the fastest rate of millionaires leaving the world per capita. There is a huge brain drain from the country. And a lot of the points you make are absolutely correct. We see some of the same tendencies, though, in the United States. You know, the acceptance of Islamism, the push for curbs on free speech. You know, Mandami's been elected in New York. I think Britain is a portent of what could happen to America if the rot isn't stopped.
Absolutely. The land of Magna Carta is now mass arresting people for what they say online. If you think I'm exaggerating, Britain arrests more people for what they say online than communist China. It's insane what is happening in Britain, and Americans should be concerned about it. Not for any sentimental reasons. Americans should be concerned about it because it shows what a once free and civilized society can turn into very rapidly. Now, I have to say, though, I'm convinced that Britain will recover. Not if Britain recovers, when Britain recovers. It will happen. We will need to replace the charlatans on the centre-right with people who actually believe in things. We will then need to address the administrative state. We will need to do so very aggressively. We will need to use extra constitutional mechanisms to get rid of activist judges. We'll need to do all of that. But when, not if that happens, we will do so inspired by the model of America. Because America, for all its faults, still is a beacon. It still is a shining city on a hill. It still shows the rest of the world the standards to which supposedly civilized Western countries should live up to. America may have lots of faults, but actually, I think Britain can learn from America. I think one area where Britain desperately needs to learn from America is the concept of free speech. It's not simply that there is a text in the Constitution, the First Amendment, that enshrines free speech. Judges have very wisely interpreted incitement in such a way in America so that, provided you're not actively inciting violence, you can pretty much say what you want. And as a result of not just a good constitution, but wise and learned judges, America is in a much better position. America is in a much better position culturally because Americans, for all the progressives attempt to undermine and demoralize America by trying to rewrite their history and make Americans feel ashamed of their past, despite all of that, America is in a much better position culturally because there are still institutions and people in America who believe in American exceptionalism. Next year, it's 250 years since America declared independence. I think we will see millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of ordinary Americans rallying to that centenary. I also think economically America will be a shining example. Here in Mississippi, and I hate to be parochial and talk about the state where I've worked to implement many of these reforms, but forgive me if I do, we have very flexible labor markets. We have very low-cost energy because we've not gone in for any of that green nonsense. We've done all the things that the Brits have got wrong. And I think a time will come fairly soon. In fact, there was a minister called Peter Kyle in Washington only a couple of weeks ago, and he specifically cited Mississippi as an example of what Britain needs to do. Now, he then went back and voted in favour of further regulating the British labour market. But he's halfway there. If he at least begins to understand that Britain should be learning from America economically, then there is hope. I'm convinced that Britain will eventually come to her senses and she will follow the American model. It's why America is all the more important. Making sure that America doesn't succumb to these European malaises is absolutely imperative.
Well, the election of Donald Trump was the cause for optimism that's happened over the past year or so. Otherwise, we'd all be extremely depressed. And it could have been Kamala Harris. I mean, that's the future we could have been facing, and quite a lot of people in the so-called Conservative Party.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's rather alarming that the editor of the number one conservative newspaper in the country, the Spectator, a man called Michael Gove, came out in support of Kamala Harris. Now, Michael, I'm sure, probably thinks it was a clever thing to say at the time, but he probably also thought it was a clever thing to sign up to zero carbon emissions at the time. He probably also thought it was a clever idea to sign up to the idea that you should tax private schools at the time. He's followed all sorts of faddish ideas that turn out to be rather disastrous. But it says something about the sorry state of British Conservatives that the editor of their leading in-house magazine, The Spectator, should be someone who thinks that Kamala Harris would have made a better leader than Donald Trump. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of things when I look at the incumbent in the White House, plenty of things I disagree with. I'm not a big fan of tariffs. But boy, do I think Donald Trump overall has been a magnificent corrective to the American system. What he's doing in terms of reining in the administrative state, fixing the immigration problem, making it absolutely clear that the American way of life is not only precious, unique, but it's worth fighting for and defending. These are all things that Europeans ought to learn from. I think America is not without its failings. The current White House is not without its failings. But the American system has once again shown that it can produce a necessary corrective. And it's, as a foreigner living in America, I constantly marvel at this country and wish I had discovered it earlier than I had.
President Trump seems to me to be more of a patriot about Britain than our own Prime Minister Keir Starmer. You know, he's actually spoken about the positive impact Britain has had on history. What do you think the Trump administration and their allies in the MAGA movement can do to help Britain in the right direction and help the populace of Britain who desperately want to be freed?
You talked earlier about the importance of Donald Trump being elected. I actually think that that was less significant than an event that happened shortly before then, which actually in many ways facilitated it. And it was Elon Musk buying X. Why was that significant? Well, basically what happened is in the old days, the elites in Europe in particular, but also in America and Britain, were able to control the narrative. And they were able to do this because they had a handful of corporate media organizations who are closely aligned to those in power, and they were able to basically drive the narrative. Along comes digital technology, and it suddenly allows people to form opinions organically, and they don't like this. So in the wake of the Brexit referendum and Donald Trump winning the first time round, the administrative state gets together with the tech bros, and they create a system in which the algorithms suppress dissident thought. And we saw this most clearly during COVID. Musk then comes along and he buys X and he says he's not going to do that. What's going to happen is that opinion and what goes viral will be determined by an algorithm that doesn't suppress dissident opinion, but actually allows the users to decide what should and shouldn't be viral content. And of course, the other digital platforms like Facebook can't not follow suit. So mask buying X not only transformed X, it transformed the entire digital landscape. Once again, the Reformation was on. The Counter-Reformation had failed. This is what is so significant. This is why in Britain, in Australia, in many Western countries, the elite are trying to bring in laws and use punitive prosecutions and exemplary sentences to suppress dissidents. Think of it not as Britain doing something wrong. Think of it as Britain and Europe behaving like a sort of soft version of the Soviet Union, because this is essentially what they're doing. They're behaving like late stage Soviet Russia. The apparatchiks within the system are doing everything they can to suppress dissident opinion. Now, one area of dissident opinion today is it's no longer COVID. The issue that people feel dissent on is mass immigration. You've had mass immigration. You've had about 4 million people in the past 5 years gross move to Britain from third world countries. The British people have been able to see this, and they don't like what they see. They are very clearly of the view that there not only needs to be an end of mass third world immigration, but many people are now advocating for remigration to throw many of these people out of the country. This view is going mainstream. What does the establishment do about it? It intentionally tries to suppress the ability of people to articulate these views. It funds third-party organizations to demonize those who talk about it. It uses the judiciary and the prosecution system to persecute dissidents who speak up about it. What should America do? If America wants to save the West, America should make it clear that it will do 4 things in defense of free speech. Number 1, Americans need to recognize how precious their own amendment is, their own Bill of Rights is. And they need to cherish in America the idea that anyone should be free to say whatever they want, however foolish and absurd. In America, you have the right to say that. You have the right to offend people. The second thing America needs to do is control mass immigration, because clearly what's happening in Britain and Europe and now in Australia is that having failed to control the borders, the administrative states in those countries now wants to control people who express concern about a failure to control borders. So control your borders, America. The third thing America needs to do is to stop treating so-called allies as equals. If Britain and Australia and European countries are going to treat their citizens as you would expect a third world banana republic to do, locking people up for what they say online, America should stop treating the regimes that run those countries as equals. They should stop giving them a defense dividend. They should stop giving them an automatic diplomatic premium. They should start to treat them as autocratic countries. And I think we're about to see that. I think it will come as a bit of a shock to the new British ambassador in Washington when he comes to realize that if Starmer doesn't about turn pretty quickly, Britain will no longer be treated as a civilized Western country. The sooner that happens, the better. And then the fourth thing America needs to do is, just like during the Soviet Union, when Ronald Reagan and the US government offered moral support to dissidents like Nathan Sharansky in Soviet Russia, I think the US State Department needs to proactively identify and encourage and provide moral support, possibly even asylum, to dissident thinkers and activists in Britain and Europe. I think it would be an incredibly powerful signal if America was to start to treat dissident activists who are being persecuted by the British state and the Australian state and the European governments, if it was to actively offer those people moral support and possible visas, and in some cases, maybe citizenship. I think it would have a potentially revolutionary effect back in the old countries. Maybe that is something America desperately needs to start doing.
And I think the national security strategy is a sign of a huge pivot by the United States, that they're no longer going to take it for granted that the European elite share their values.
Imagine a scenario in which one of the police officers involved in the arrest of an online activist, or one of the judges involved in the persecution of an online activist, or one of the Department of Public Prosecution officials was trying to go on vacation with their family to Florida. and was detained at Florida Airport, put in an ICE detention facility and sent back to Britain, or straightforward denied a visa, that would have a tremendously sobering effect on the apparatchiks. And we should start calling them apparatchiks because they are essentially behaving like Soviet-era apparatchiks in Russia. If the apparatchiks were individually targeted and sanctioned by the US government, if the judges involved in some of these cases in Britain were put on a watch list by the authorities in America and treated as agents of a hostile regime, I think we would start to see a pretty dramatic about turn in Britain. But I'm afraid to say I think it will require the new world taking that kind of action to bring the old world to its senses. I would dearly love to see some in the Trump administration, I think, are already toying with these ideas, start to sanction the individual apparatchiks involved in some of these egregious cases.
Very, very interesting ideas there. However, I believe that these Eurocrats, these British bureaucrats, have just become so infected with the woke mind virus. I don't think there's any kind of pressure that could really turn them apart from, pressure from outside. And what I mean by that is popular pressure of the public voting out the government and actually finding people who are, I don't believe that they're ever going to experience the about turn in the same way as the American liberals are now moving to the Cotswolds because they're suffering from Trump derangement syndrome.
So, I mean, I think Britain clearly needs, having acquired home rule with Brexit, Britain now needs to change who rules at home. We have a class of people in Britain, they're often called the lanyard-wearing classes. They are superficially clever. They're career officials, career bureaucrats, career technocrats. They have an exaggerated belief in the ability to know what needs to be done to engineer outcomes in society. Clearly, Britain can't flourish unless it finds a way of removing them. People talk about, how can we make the British administrative state function better? How can we deregulate? No. You need to deconstruct. You need the large scale closure of large parts of the British administrative state. It's beyond redemption. They will fight you tooth and nail to do this. Absolutely. We were talking about what America can do, and I outlined some things that America needs to do to deal with the most egregious instances of autocracy in Britain. But fundamentally, to achieve the whole-scale change that's needed, you need to have number one, a new centre-right majority. That may be conservative, it may be reform, it may be a combination of the two. You need them to come along with a clear parliamentary majority. However, that is not going to be enough. And if we rely simply on winning elections, we're never going to change a thing. Why? We saw, Liz, what happened to you. We know how the administrative state operates. You were essentially defenestrated by officials who colluded to remove you from office. Now, some might say it was easier to remove you from office than others, partly because you weren't elected directly as prime minister. But you weren't the first elected official who was defenestrated in that way. Your colleague Dominic Raab was defenestrated by the administrative state. And of course, Boris Johnson himself was, I would argue, largely defenestrated by the administrative state. So in order to affect change, you not only need to win an election, you need a blueprint. Now, I've come up with something called milestones, which is a blueprint that I think a future government needs to take on board and implement. And it requires figuring out what you want to do before you win that election. You need orders in council signed by the king before you form a government that allow you to sack any senior civil servant you want. You need orders in council to allow you to take away from the Treasury many of the powers that they've taken for themselves. You need orders in council that allow you to, in effect, abolish the cabinet office. And instead of having a cabinet secretary who is the chief toady of the administrative state, you need the ability to appoint a cabinet secretary as your prime minister's chief of staff. You need to have essentially done what Donald Trump did in his second term, when he sat in the Oval Office in those early days of his second term and signed those executive orders. He and Steve Miller had figured out exactly what levers they needed to pull to deliver change. We need our equivalent of Steve Miller figuring out what we need to do so that when we win a majority, instead of being defenestrated by the administrative state, we can take control of the machinery of government. You also need a similar plan to deal with the activist judges. You also need a plan to pass emergency legislation to allow you to seize control of the borders and to begin the mass removal of the 2.5 million illegal immigrants in the country. But you need to figure all of this out before you fight that election. If you're only beginning to figure out what to do once you've won office, you're always going to be in office, but never in power.
Well, Douglas, I hope that you will come back to Britain to help sort the situation out when the time is right. Thank you very much for coming on the Truss show today. It's been great to have you on board, and I do hope that you will return eventually.
Hope that was helpful. Thank you so much.
As you can hear, Douglas Carswell moving to the United States has been a great loss for Britain. He was somebody with the right ideas about what needed to be done to take on the deep state, take on the administrative state, and restore our national sovereignty, dealing with problems like mass migration, a loss of free speech, and the economic and cultural decline that we're experiencing. His advice to the US administration is absolutely right. We need to get tough if we are to back the people of Britain and Europe against the unelected establishment.